Hi, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. It's great to see people already here in the chat. I am Alice Markham-Cantor. I'm the author of The Once and Future Witch Hunt, A Descendant's Reckoning from Salem to the Present. And I am really excited to be here today to talk with you all. Um, my nine times great-grandmother was a woman named Martha Carrier, who was hanged in the Salem witch trials of 1692 in the second to last hanging. And my book tells the story of her life, but it also tells the story of what happened in Salem. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Um, and actually, as we get started, I'm going to do some. I think we're going to have time for some questions at the end. But as we get started, if people want to throw into the chat um, what you think may have happened in Salem, what you like, any factors that you think might have played in, because there's no wrong answers, but there's a lot of information floating around out there about Salem. So if people have things they already think, I would love to know. And I'll give you guys like 30 seconds to do that. And if no one has any thoughts, that's okay too. Feminine suppression, greed and fear and power grabbing. People were jealous of successful folks. This is all absolutely accurate. Um, Amazing. Oh my goodness, I've heard so many different things. Women's power needed to be put down. Land grabbing had a hand in it. Neighbor disputes, land grab. Okay, well this is a great start to bring us in. So I'm going to start a little bit with just sort of a quick overview of what happened in Salem. What was the Salem witch hunt? So Massachusetts is cursed. Someone said in the chat. That's a possibility. The Salem witch hunt begins in January of 1692 when people first start claiming that they are afflicted by witches. And the final trial happens in January of 1693. So you can sort of think of it spanning about a year. Hundreds of people are accused, both in Salem village and in other surrounding towns and villages. Someone is accused even as far away as Maine, so it's really not just in Salem. And formal legal action is taken against more than 100 people, making this far and away America's largest witch hunt. Then more than 50 people who are accused confess to witchcraft. And in addition to those 50, 19 other people are tried and executed. So in total, 19 people are executed, 5 more die in prison, and 1 man is tortured to death. And then it all comes to an end, and it leaves, the rest of Massachusetts and all of us in the next few hundred years to wonder how this could have happened. How does a community get to a point where it can turn on itself to the point where it executes 19 people for witchcraft? So, uh, witch witch hunts are a lot like wildfires. There's a model that I like to use where first, in order for a witch hunt to take place, the ground has to be primed for it, the same way that underbrush has to build up before a forest fire can happen. Then there has to be a spark. There has to be something that sets off a moment of fear and a moment of witches, like the threat of witches being a very present thing. And then finally, there have to be people who fan the flames, or at least don't stop them. And these are usually people in power of some kind. And so I'm going to start by talking about the spark, because in Salem, that's a pretty famous part of things, and people usually know about this. So the spark in Salem happens in January of 1692 when 2 young girls, the 9-year-old daughter and 11-year-old niece of the Salem village minister, start to have strange fits. They talk gibberish, they gesture wildly, they have some convulsions and complain of pains. They also refuse to act properly. They neglect their chores, they won't say their prayers. But the minister summons physicians, and the physicians examine the girls, and they're stumped. They're like, we know about epilepsy. That doesn't look like this. We're not sure what this is. And these fits continue for about a month before a local physician makes the diagnosis that the girls are under an evil hand. In other words, their affliction is supernatural in origin, and they are afflicted by the devil or by the devil's servants. Um, so this is the spark in this moment. It's this unexplained illness, this unexplained affliction, and then this physician saying, "Okay, I think that this has to be witchcraft." And then other girls in the village start experiencing similar afflictions, and they accuse a handful of local women of witchcraft, and then the accusations start to spiral. More people are accused, more people experience affliction, more people are accused. But we're actually not really going to talk so much about what happened next. I want to take us back a little bit in time because these fits that these two girls had were not unprecedented. Other people, especially other young women, had similar fits in Puritan Massachusetts, but only Salem had a witch hunt on this scale. So, in the wildfire model, if the girls' fits provided the spark for the witch hunt, in order to understand what actually happened, we also have to understand how the ground got primed and why Salem Village was a place where a witch hunt could happen. So we're going to start with Puritanism as a big primer. I've seen some people throw that into the chat, and you are absolutely correct. So really quickly, what's Puritanism? Puritanism it's a fundamentalist Protestant sect of Christianity. The Puritans were committed to purifying Christianity as they saw it to just scripture and stripping away what they thought was the sort of decadence of Catholicism and even of Anglicanism and other sects. And so in the early 1600s, many Puritans settle in the British colony of Massachusetts Bay because they have a charter from the King of England, a document that lets them govern themselves in the eyes of England. It says they can make their own laws and form their own courts and gives them some measure of political independence. But they're not just envisioning their new colony as a new political entity. They envision it as a new holy land. The idea is that they are trying to create in the new world a society that is godly. Their religious values will be enshrined in law, and they will sort of create a new holy land in the new world. Of course, what this means in practice is basically a Puritan theocracy. So yes, Puritan values are enshrined in law, but other Christian denominations like Baptists are marginalized. Quakers are entirely driven out. They really did not like the Quakers and would discriminate against them. And so one other important thing here is the Puritans very wholeheartedly believed in the devil. They believe that the devil is, will punish them when they stray from God and will also try to tempt them away from God, and will try to stop their project in the New World, their sort of creation of this holy society, if he can. So they are constantly on guard against the devil. And they also conceive of witches as the devil's servants. They specifically believe that witches are antagonistic toward God and are aiding the devil in his sort of endless quest to corrupt and destroy humanity. So these are some reasons why Puritanism is particularly fertile ground for a witch hunt to grow in. They believe that the devil and his servants, witches, are their antagonists in their efforts to create a holy land in the New World. But this is all of Puritan Massachusetts. So let's zoom in a little. Why Salem? So this has to do a lot with the place called Salem Village and its relationship to the rest of Massachusetts. So Salem Village is not modern day Salem. The Salem of today in 1692 was known as Salem Town, and it was Salem Village's next door neighbor. If you can see on the screen, what's outlined in the dark line is Salem Village, and then down here, you can't really see it, but in the bottom right-hand corner is Salem Town. Salem Village today is known as Danvers. It changed its name in the mid-1700s. And so Salem Village at the time was a parish of Salem Town. So Salem Village had its own internal council, and it had its own church, but it is not independent and it has to pay taxes to the town. And it has this very complicated relationship with Salem town, but it boils down to Salem Village is in a kind of political limbo. It can't really fully make its own decisions. Its tax money is flowing somewhere else, and um, it doesn't have political control over everything that it would like to have political control over. But one might expect that having sort of an external enemy in Salem town would unite the Salem villagers in their efforts for independence. And it did do that for some of them. But instead of uniting everyone, Salem Village becomes known in Massachusetts for its uh, uh, sort of internal disputes. It becomes known for its infighting. There are a lot of property disputes. There are a lot of inheritance disputes. A lot of this has to do with the fact that it can't expand. So, they've got all these other towns bordering them that are all independent towns, and they can't sort of move their borders. And so if you have 5 sons and you need to split up your land between all of your sons, they're each going to have a much smaller plot than you did. So you've got a lot of families that uh, they have decreasing fortunes. Their parents or their grandparents were doing better economically than they are. And it all contributes to this feeling that, you know, people are seeing there's disputes, there's bad feeling, there's old grudges, and some of these grudges do later surface in the form of witchcraft accusations. Um, but there's also another major conflict, and this conflict has to do with the Salem Village Church. So the minister, the man who is the father and uncle of the first 2 girls who start to experience witchcraft affliction, claim to, he has been the minister of Salem for only 3 years when the trials start. His name is Samuel Parris, and he comes to ministering as a second career. He actually first ran a slave plantation on Barbados, lost it, then tried to be a merchant, failed, and then comes to ministering as sort of a third career. And he is not very well liked. He is embroiled in disputes over his compensation, which many townspeople think was too generous. And he's also involved in major disputes about his church's dogma, which is pretty conservative even for the time. And it circles around this thing called church membership, which I'm not going to go too deep into right now because I know I'm throwing a lot of information out there. But the basic idea is that everyone in Puritan Massachusetts goes to church, but only some people are members of the church, which is sort of like a exclusive elite group within all the villagers who have certain rights within the church. They can take part in certain rituals, and they also have certain responsibilities. And Samuel Parris is urging all of his parishioners to become full members. Uh, he's doing this because he thinks it will be good for their souls, but he is also getting a lot of resistance. It's a serious spiritual undertaking to become the full member of a church. It's like not something that people sort of do willy-nilly, and there's probably a lot of them who don't particularly want to do it with Samuel Parris, who they don't like very much. But he has been getting more and more insistent, and people are getting madder and madder at him within the village. Uh, and so the church dispute is really important because it creates the conditions for the spark, which we talked about earlier, which is when his daughter and his niece start screaming. So what happens is that in October of 1691, just a few months before the first accusations of witchcraft, the villagers basically rebel. His political enemies take over the Salem Village Council in an election, but in sort of a surprise election. They throw out the previous people who were political allies of Parris's, and they install people who don't like him, and none of them are church members, the new village council. And they can't outright fire him. They can't outright fire Parris, excuse me, although they would like to. But what they can do is stop paying him. They're in charge of collecting and distributing his salary. And so they announce they're just not going to do that anymore. And the hope is that he'll leave of his own accord. He doesn't leave of his own accord. Samuel Parris it sends him into a tailspin. He starts spiraling, and he lambasts them in his sermons. He calls his parishioners sinners who will be punished by the devil. And in the next few months, and then especially, increasing as the winter goes on, um, they are the sermons of a man who believes with deep certainty that he and his church are under attack. And this just grows as, December turns into January, because it's an exceptionally cold winter, and part of his salary that they were supposed to pay him and are refusing to pay him is firewood. So he feels like this is a real attack on his church. How could they be so impious and, to come up against their minister in this way? He really, really feels like he's under attack. And then, quite suddenly, his daughter and his niece start having these unexplained illnesses, these fits. And the doctors can't explain them until they say maybe it's supernatural. And basically, Parris has spent the last few months feeling like his church is under attack. Now his home is under attack. He is 100% ready to believe that there are witches in his village. And that's why everything's been going badly. So by the middle of February, a month after the girls start having these fits, Parris is preaching to the village that the village contains assistants of Satan. In other words, witches. That's actually, if he had called any single person an assistant of Satan, that would have been a legal accusation of witchcraft. He leaves it broad, but he clearly thinks that there are witches in the village. And then we can also see the dispute over church membership play out as the accusations begin. So the accusers, the afflicted girls, mostly come from families and that are full member families. Um, and they are mostly accusing people who are not full members of the church. So we can sort of see that split and see how the village has been primed to have one group really, really distrust the other. And so the church dispute is really what sort of preps everyone, not just Samuel Parris, but everyone, to believe that the people who have been resisting his church, these aren't just people who disagree with their minister. They're actually agents of Satan. So that's one part of it, and that's how Samuel Parris sort of becomes this major fire starter. But there's somebody else who also is a major fanner of the flames, and here's what happens: just as the daughter and the niece of Samuel Parris start, or just as they're naming their first a first handful of women as witches, another girl also starts showing signs of affliction and makes accusations. She's a 12-year-old named Ann Putnam, and her father, Thomas Putnam, is the one who actually then rides to Salem town to file the first official complaints of witchcraft and to set the trials in motion. So if he doesn't do this, it doesn't actually enter the courts and it doesn't play out. And Thomas Putnam he's a leader in village politics. He's Samuel Parris's political ally, and he's also something of a malcontent. So, how I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of these families in Salem village that have seen their fortunes declining. Their parents or their grandparents had more wealth and more prospects than they do. This is Thomas Putnam's situation. So he grows up as the son of one of the wealthiest men in Salem village. And by the time he is an adult, he is nothing of the sort. He loses a couple inheritances to other relatives. He's involved in all these property disputes, inheritance disputes. And he's just overall a man who, despite his best efforts, has remained poorer than he thinks he should be. So he's absolutely ready to believe that his village and his life are also under attack. He knows he's under attack. And so Thomas Putnam takes legal action. He really helps to spur the Salem witch trials into a massive legal endeavor. His daughter is an accuser. His wife becomes the first adult accuser. His maid becomes an accuser. A bunch of his relatives are accusers. And in total, he writes up a lot of their testimony and their depositions, their indictments. And in total, he writes out 120 depositions, indictments, and supporting testimonies. This is a full third of all such surviving documents from the Salem witch trials. Let me say that again. Thomas Putnam has a hand in writing almost a third of all of this kind of document that help propel the trials. In total, he and his daughter Anne actually have a hand in accusing more than 2/3 of the people who will be executed for witchcraft. And it probably won't surprise anyone when I say that some of the people who are accused are indeed people with whom the Putnam family has old grudges. You know, people with whom they or their families have had disputes. Now, I do want to say quickly that the records don't reveal an active conspiracy, among the Putnams or with the Putnam and Parris families. Um, and it's important to remember that the Puritans really believe in witches as like that witches are trying to hurt them in this way. They really they conceive of witches in this manner. And so Thomas Putnam very likely believed the accusations he was making, because it would have been sensible in his mind for all of his old enemies to turn out to be witches, because he can then make the sort of retroactive justification that that's why they were his enemies. That's why they were, trying to take his inheritance or trying to plant on his land. Um, so it's not an active conspiracy necessarily, but it is sort of the grudges lay the groundwork for this kind of for these kinds of accusations. So ground is primed with all this bad feeling, and the Puritans' belief system really preps them for a witch hunt. Um, and then there's one more thing that happened. There's one more thing that really makes Salem make sense. So as the trials progress, so do the stories that the accusers and confessors are telling about what the devil allegedly wanted, right? So as more and more people are making accusations and people are confessing to witchcraft, they're telling stories about, why did they become a witch? What did the devil want them to do? And sort of to explain, like, why is the devil afflicting these people in Salem Village? And the idea begins to surface that the witches are not individual malevolent actors. They're not just here to afflict people in Salem Village. Instead, they might be part of an organized plot to tear down the churches and government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and to set up the devil's kingdom in its place. So they are afraid that the idea is that the devil is here actually trying to foil the Puritan project in the New World, this attempt to create their new holy society, and instead wants to create the devil's kingdom. And this, of course, isn't true. There is no witch conspiracy. But the belief that the Puritan Holy Land project is under attack isn't entirely wrong. Because what happened is that 10 years before the Salem witch trials, the King of England revoked their charter, the document that gave them political power over the colony, um, as punishment for the Puritans disobeying him. And a new charter was issued the year before the trials, and it actually arrives in Massachusetts just 1 month before the first accusations are made. Um, but it is a pale shadow of the old charter. It does not do what the Puritans want it to do. It gives them way less political autonomy. They're much more under England's control. And it also mandates religious tolerance for all Christians except Catholics. They can still discriminate against Catholics, but all other Christians, they have to be religiously tolerant toward. Non-Puritans can no longer be legally prohibited from participating in civic life, like from voting or from serving on juries. Um, in other words, people who they, may see as heretics are about to get political rights in the Puritan Holy Land. So there was something threatening to transform the very shape of Puritan New England. Their churches are under attack in the sense that their churches will no longer be supreme in the land. The Puritans are just wrong about the culprit. They assign this threat to their way of life to the devil and to the devil's witches, when in reality it's the new political and economic paradigm that's being enforced as England tightens its grip on its colony. So, why are we still talking about this? Why does this still matter? I'm going to bring us 332 years into the future to now. We tend to think of witch hunts. We tend to think of witch hunts as a thing of the past. They really are not. In the past 10 years, as many as 20,000 people have been killed, tortured, harmed, exiled, or otherwise suffered adverse consequences after being accused of witchcraft. These hunts have taken place all over the world, and they often target people who are older. They especially target women. There's an increasing number of children who are the targets of witch hunts, as well as people with albinism. And like in Salem, these are economically and politically contextualized attacks much of the time. So when we look at them through the wildfire model, we can see that just like in Salem, a community will be primed primed for a hunt either by economic upheaval, massive privatization, leading to the loss of land, leading to people having fewer prospects than they used to. The loss of social and economic safety nets is a huge factor. And then again, there will be a spark that's often still today an unexplained illness in a place without adequate healthcare systems. And then often some kind of witch hunter or spiritual leader, including pastors, may be involved to help fan the flames. And so, like Thomas Putnam and Samuel Parris, people still today use witch hunts, definitely as a way to settle old grudges and even to seize a relative's land, but also most of all to make sense of a world in which they are not having the life that they imagined they would have. So I'm going to turn to questions in a second, and I'll just close by saying that, my ancestor, Martha Carrier, was hanged more than 300 years ago, but Salem's story never ended. And I'm really glad you're all here today because it's up to all of us to change the story about why witch hunts happen, to understand what happened in the past and what's happening around the world today so that we can more effectively stop them. So I think we have a few minutes for questions, probably only a little bit of time, but if anyone has one, I would love to hear. And I'm seeing in the chat already, a lot of today's issues are the aftermath of colonialization and colonialism. That's absolutely true. Most witch hunts happening today happen in countries that were previously colonized. And this has to do a lot with the way that countries that were previously colonized are forced into economic straits by the IMF and the World Bank. And the economic policies that are then enforced help give rise to the conditions for a witch hunt. What do you think about the GOP wanting a state religion? I think it very much sounds like they're Puritans 2.0. I think that I think it's bad, if that's what you were asking. But I also, yes, I think that it very, very much sounds like exactly what the Puritans in 1692 wanted, a chance to create a Puritan theocracy where they use scripture to demonize and enforce certain laws and norms. So interesting that the people who want religious theocracy now would have been excluded by the founders. Interesting. Yeah. And I've been seeing a lot about patriarchy in the chat, and unfortunately I wanted to make this that would have made the presentation much longer, but yes, patriarchy absolutely plays into the Salem witch hunts, as well as to most witch hunts. Still about probably around 80%, we don't have great numbers, but probably around 80% of witch hunt victims around the world today are also women. And so that absolutely is a huge aspect. Is there anything history teaches us for smothering the flames? I mean, I think it's an excellent question, and I think that really has to do with we have to get better at learning how to recognize the fact that witch hunts always target the most marginalized members of society first, right? So in Salem, they start by accusing a local beggar woman, a woman who hasn't been to church in years and so has a very negative reputation, and a woman who is enslaved. Um, and I think what one of Salem's big lessons is that although that sort of is the test, right? They're always going to start by accusing the most marginalized people in society, and that's when you have to jump in. You can't wait until it picks up steam. Um, the last agency, yep, that's so true. Um, and what is Alice's book? My book is actually here. I can go one more because then it's there. It's The Once and Future Witch Hunt, a descendant's reckoning from Salem to the present. And you can find me at alicemarkhamcantor.com, um, and order the book there as well as through Llewellyn. I think Llewellyn just dropped the link to the book in the chat. Um, yeah, I think that is about where I think we're right at 2:30. But thank you all so much for coming, and I've really enjoyed this.